First of all, my name is Cheyenne, and this is Victor.
Hi, I'm Victor. I'm a student at JMSB at Concordia. Big fan of the UFC.
And we're going to be talking about the UFC as a company and just their entrepreneurial journey and,
growth throughout the years.
So how basically looking at it through the framework of this class and everything we've learned so far and applying it to the UFC.
Right. So should we start with their foundation and the early years, like how they started out?
Yeah. So basically, the UFC started out as a company founded by 3 individuals, and 2 of which were in the film industry. They Art Davie and John Milius both worked on Dirty Harry, and also Rory Gracie, a jiu-jitsu.
He's a jiu-jitsu practitioner, expert at jiu-jitsu, a black belt. So the Gracie family has a long lineage with Brazilian jiu-jitsu. They actually basically founded it how it's practiced today. So he's very well respected in this space, and so he had some connections with jiu-jitsu practitioners and other fighters at the time.
Mm-hmm. And so Rory Gracie was one of the founders of jiu-jitsu, and having this nice, diverse, 2 guys that are in the movie industry, and then 1 guy who's also a martial artist. It gave them a bit of an edge onto, come up with something cool.
Right.
So initially the UFC was called War of the Worlds, and they decided that they wanted to do it only one time as a one-time thing.
Right.
So they founded the company in 1993, and they did their first event.
And they basically just matched up different martial arts styles. So kung fu, karate, jiu-jitsu, wrestling was involved, boxing, and just the goal was just to see which one came out on top and who won. It was really just a one-night tournament style where all the martial arts were represented by different martial artists to see who came out on top.
Yeah, and I mean, the numbers did so well on pay-per-view that they said, why should we just do it as a one-time event? Let's do it again and again to eventually, started gaining traction. They saw a potential future.
Right.
But, I mean, with more attention came more eyeballs from the government and legislators who said, the sport isn't very...
safe, or at least that's what they thought at the time. Yeah. They were worried about the safety of the athletes. And it was a very unconventional sport. They had never seen anything like it. I mean, the closest thing at the time was, I guess, kickboxing, but kickboxing even then was in its infancy, and there was no real ground game, any jiu-jitsu or wrestling in kickboxing, so something really completely different that they hadn't seen before.
No protection whatsoever, and no weight classes, so a guy who's like 6'5" could fight a guy who's like
me.
Yeah, exactly. So it was a bit mind-boggling to see. So Senator John McCain and some other legislators were trying to get rid of this company and put some regulation. And this really it
increased the costs for the company a lot. They had to pay a lot to try to get laws passed to allow them to have events in different states, and there a lot of different television networks refused to air their fights. So they were really having a lot of problems. So that led them to, they started having a loss at that time.
Yeah, they had a big loss, and just they wanted to educate the people, and it was they took their losses. So what this did to the company, it started making them go bankrupt, and at this point, Dana White and his
the Fertitta brothers, were childhood friends of his.
They approached the table and they said, we're going to buy this company for $2 million.
Yeah.
And they created Zuffa, which is now the parent entity controlling the UFC. And basically, we're at the point of saying, who is Dana White?
Exactly.
Why don't you tell me who Dana White is?
So Dana White, he's a boxing... Well, he started off early in his career. He wanted to be a boxer, and then he quickly realized that wasn't going to happen, so he became a boxing coach. And then he had aspirations to be a boxing promoter as well. So he was really involved in the fighting business. So that gave him an edge over the competition.
And so that was who he was under the effectual cycle. If we want to look at it through the bird in hand theory, he was a guy who was in the sports of combat.
Exactly.
And also, who did he know?
So he knew, as mentioned previously, the Fertitta brothers, who their father was a gambling casino tycoon in Las Vegas, and so they had quite a bit of money on available to them to make the purchase happen. Dana White also knew the people that he used to train at the boxing gym when he used to work there in Boston. As well as two martial artists, one Chuck Liddell and Tito Ortiz, who became two of the biggest stars in the UFC later on when in their careers.
Yeah, so Dana White actually managed those two individuals, and they became the biggest superstars of the UFC, believe it or not, at the time. So, I mean, having that network of both investors and the talent, the martial artists, really gave him a nice a view and vision of what the sport was going to be.
Right, it gave him a serious competitive advantage against the competition.
Yeah, which was not really, there wasn't too many competition at the time. So, and also what he knew was that world. But in terms of just what his goal was, he said it himself that it was to be the most dominant sport in combat sport in the world.
Yeah. I'd say he managed to pull that off. As lofty of a goal that is, I think at this point in time he's managed to achieve it.
For sure, it's bigger than boxing nowadays.
Right.
So another key thing that the UFC did and Dana White did under the effectual cycle was they interacted with more people. So they gathered more stakeholder commitments, who we could see as the Fertitta brothers. The Fertitta brothers, my bad.
And also different television programming networks, right? Like Fox and Spike, they went in contact with them.
Yeah.
A bunch of other, as mentioned before, the legislators to change the laws to make to make the sport legal in New York, New Jersey, California, which were some of the biggest areas where the sport was popular, but just not legal.
Yeah, and like kind of just going back into the class material, when you start off as an entrepreneur, those three individuals, they wanted to do everything at once kind of thing, like they wanted to be both the entrepreneur and both the promoter and all this stuff, and also the people who talk to the lawmakers. But I mean, it kind of creates a chaotic environment and not too much organization. Right. And under Dana White, they brought that organization. They kind of prioritized making the rules and regulations and making the UFC a legitimate sport where...
and they were willing to sacrifice certain rules in the sport to get the laws passed in different states. So there's certain laws that are different from state to state just so that they could manage to get those laws passed. Very small things like if an opponent is grounded with one knee on the ground versus two knees, or just small little tweaks like that so that he could ensure that the sport would be allowed in every state in the United States.
Yes, you kind of have to compromise to make your vision work everywhere on a big scale. With all the legislations being changed, they saw that as an affordable loss because, as mentioned before, the UFC was not really a profitable company at the time.
Yeah, and it wasn't growing pretty much at all. If anything, it was shrinking.
It was shrinking, yeah. I mean, the first 4 years, they lost $34 million.
Yeah.
I don't know about you, but I don't have that kind of money to lose.
No, definitely not.
So I mean, they took a big step into saying like, okay, this is an affordable loss, but we're gonna keep going forward, and we're gonna try to make these legislators understand that this isn't such a bad thing.
Right. Yeah, they saw the opportunity going forward that if the changes that needed to be made were made, that loss could be turned to a profit.
Yeah, and I mean they did so because later on, just a couple years later, Fox decided to partner up with the UFC and host their fights on their network.
Which gave them a lot more broad coverage and a lot more eyeballs on the sport.
Exactly. Yeah. It expanded their points of contact with their customers. More and more people from word of mouth are saying, hey, did you see the UFC is on Fox?
And that's one of the main things early on in the Fox days with the Ultimate Fighter series, which is basically where there's two teams of different fighters that are matched against each other, and at the end, so there's the two coaches fight each other. The first Ultimate Fighter, where the two coaches were Stephan Bonnar and Forrest Griffin, and that fight ended up generating as the fight went on more and more views because people were calling their friends, telling, hey, like tune in. And Dana White himself has stated that moment as one of the most pivotal moments in the UFC's history.
For sure. I mean, we're all invested. The UFC itself when it decided to come out with Tough, the Ultimate Fighter series, I mean, they first off, they did it on Spike Network. It wasn't with Fox. So they decided it was a reality show. So more and more people are invested in the story of these fighters rather than just watching the sport. We're invested in to like if this guy's gonna win, because at this point, you've seen the guy, you've seen the
you have an emotional connection.
Yeah, you have an emotional connection. You've seen what he's gone through.
Yeah.
And so through having this, it generates more eyeballs onto their other platform, which is the actual live sport, the pay-per-views. So that definitely made a huge change.
Mm-hmm. And so that really helped them put it all together, right?
Yeah, for sure.
They really incorporated the Fox deal to gain more viewership on their fights, and then they had the Spike deal for the Ultimate Fighter series, which just gained more and more media, so more touch points with the customer, and that really helped them expand the company. For
sure. And just an example of the Lemonade, the leverage contingency. At the time, the only, not a lot of people were allowing the UFC to kind of host their fights at their places.
Yeah.
And I mean, as surprising as it may sound, Donald Trump was one of the first guys, who hosted at the Taj Mahal and some other
of his casinos and hotels.
Yeah. So he kind of took the Lemonade. He took the risk with support of they're hosting the early events, but he saw opportunity, and that does.
Yeah, he risked his personal image, but as we know, any media is good media for him.
Exactly. So, I don't think he really cares too much of his personal image.
So he was just happy to have that event in his casino hotel.
For sure. Yeah. So I mean, later on, if we want to look at the patchwork for UFC, as they grew as a company. The UFC, they started to say, okay, we want to monopolize.
Yeah, they started making acquisitions.
Yeah, we want to be the biggest, the top dogs in this game. So they decided to buy another a competitor, Strikeforce.
Right, and then also WEC, right?
Yeah, WEC.
Yeah, and that brought in a lot of top talent as well. Some of the biggest stars. Ronda Rousey came in from WEC, I believe. Anthony Pettis, who's another top star in the UFC. So yeah,
and just exposing yourself to more and more your competitors' markets and stuff kind of makes your company go through these changes. And I mean, with the WEC coming in, they decided. I mean, later on in 2012, that was also a pivotal moment when they decided we're gonna have women's fighters.
Absolutely, yeah.
Ronda
So
Rousey.
that was really in that instance they were really, piloting the plane, so to speak, in towards the female audience. They made it a statement to include Ronda Rousey in the UFC. She was the first female champion, and then even to this day, they'll have female fights, even if they're lower ranked than the men. They'll make sure to have 1 or 2 female fights on the main card just to gain exposure to that market, to grow that market, as well as investing in new locations. So they're having fights in Abu Dhabi now, during the coronavirus, and they're working a lot to increase the number of Chinese fighters in their sport, to increase that market. So they're really broadening their.
If you look at it, the UFC is a very international sport. I mean, a lot of their fighters, their champion, you could see from Nigeria, China, Brazil. Brazil is one of the main, and I mean there are some American champions, but it's a very mixed sport. So. It also gives opportunity to people who are underprivileged. Like Francis Ngannou is a perfect example of that.
From Cameroon, I believe. Huh?
Yeah, and just has no opportunity.
I think he started working child labor in a sand mine.
Sand dune, exactly, and didn't have enough money to even buy a pencil or notebook for his class. And I mean that itself is just a tragic story. But we see
now he's made it.
He's gotten the opportunity from this company. But another thing that I want to mention in terms of piloting the plane and just the overall opening up their new locations and new market is the customer touch points that they brought forward, against their competitors. What does that mean, customer touch points? I mean, we see it through obviously their pay-per-view, through Tough, the reality show.
The most obvious would be the in-person fights, which are not really happening as much anymore. But they have a bunch of other media, huh?
Yeah, I mean they sell out stadiums and stuff. That's definitely one of the things. but they do have other media, such as like, you know, a lot of fighters actually have their own podcasts.
Right, their own YouTube channels.
Joe Rogan, I mean, he's the perfect example of why I watch UFC, probably why you watch UFC.
He's the one who introduced me to it as well.
Yeah, because Joe Rogan is also another touch point because he's the commentator for UFC. He's also the guy who does the post-fight and analysis.
Yeah, and he has one of the biggest podcasts in the world.
Exactly.
So that really brought a lot of eyes to the UFC.
Fight Companion.
Fight Companion as well. So that's like a series that follows the fighters in the week before the fight.
Yeah.
Then you have...
and it's very high production. It's like, you know, they make like a 45-minute documentary kind of like, you know, style. It's almost like you're watching an animal documentary with David Attenborough. I swear to God.
It is. It's true.
You know, like you see these fighters training and stuff.
Yeah.
Like they're really into it.
Yeah, and then another touch point, they started a bit earlier on, but The Ultimate Fighter was a new touch point.
Yeah.
And now they're starting, I mean, they have that still, but they're starting an alternate version, which is called Dana White's Contender Series, which is kind of similar.
And also the video games. We
absolutely.
forgot to mention they made so many video games. You know, starting in 2004, I think, till this day. You know, they slap a picture of Conor McGregor. I mean, he's probably the prime example of a touch point. You know, you see Conor.
His whiskey is a touch point.
Yeah, his whiskey. I mean, any of these guys, these fighters now. Dustin Poirier.
With the hot sauce.
Yeah, he came out with his own hot sauce. And their Instagram pages, you know, listening like to Joe Rogan for me, you hear about these fighters and what they go through. It's like, oh, like I'm interested now. I've heard about this guy. Like I'm
more committed to them.
Yeah, I'm more committed to them. And you know, that's the modern day has definitely made a big change. You know?
But they have had issues with their new media and stuff like that, with the new pay-per-view models and things like that. They've had some issues with piracy.
Oh yeah, for sure. Dana White recently. I mean, this is kind of like the rules of the creative economy more, but we see piracy everywhere, and you know, like
he's trying to crack down on it, and he's successfully closed down, I think, one or two of the biggest sources of it, but it's still quite rampant, and that's something that he's definitely mentioned he wants to work on.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's not as bad because a lot of people like to get good HD quality fights and without having to, you know, worry about lag or like missing the pivotal moment. But I mean, listen, it's very prevalent, and you know, it's an issue that the UFC's kind of has to deal with right now. Is how they're going to crack down on streamers.
Right,
you know?
But that's an issue that plagues pretty much everybody in that space.
Yeah.
And the UFC has shown dominance over their competitors as well.
For sure.
Like they have many more touch points and much more media than their competitors, such as Bellator or ONE FC, One Fighting Championship. Mm-hmm. Which is the Asian counterpart basically to the UFC. They've shown an absolute dominance in the media and marketing segment.
Of course. I mean, when you get ESPN recently, 2018, they just signed a deal with the UFC to partner up with them. And because first it was Fox, but UFC kind of saw a bigger deal with ESPN, who is now purchased by Disney. So Disney kind of owns the UFC. Not really, but
they definitely have a strong partnership with
the UFC,
they
have a strong
stake. Big company to have a deal with.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, Disney and the UFC doesn't seem to hand in hand.
It's a long way from a one-time War of the Worlds fight.
Exactly.
So they came Dana White. I think he made good on his promise.
It's true. I mean, it's true. So yeah, I mean, now with the ESPN contract, they have this new service. What's it called? You know the service that they have?
ESPN Plus?
ESPN Plus, but UFC offers
UFC Fight Pass as well.
Fight Pass. Yeah. So it's basically like a streaming service.
It's a subscription service.
It's a subscription service, but also like a streaming service. Yeah. So it's kind of like Netflix for UFC. Yeah. You can open it up.
And you can watch any fight from the past, and it's just a new stream of revenue that doesn't cost them much because they already have these fights logged.
Exactly, because you can't really find these fights on YouTube. Yeah. So, I mean, and it's not just the UFC. It's also, Strike Force.
Right, all the companies that they've acquired throughout the years.
I hope you enjoyed this, and maybe you've learned something that you haven't before, and yeah, thank you so much.